Hi everybody, in today's video we're going to be taking a look at all the different types of paint and what they mean. So for instance, what is a base paint, what is a layer paint, and what is an ink. So primers are what we use at the very start of our paint job, and essentially the job of a primer is to allow your actual base paints and further paints to actually stick to your model. Now primers can come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. We've got ones like here, which is an airbrush primer. And then these two here are, as you can see, rattle can primers, but they're also brush-on primers as well. Equally, primers can come in all sorts of different colors as well. Primarily you tend to see is things like this, which is a black primer, and also gray primers are used quite a lot. However, things like this one here, which is a metallic silver primer, these are absolutely ideal if you're doing, say, a squad of Necron warriors, because you could prime them in this lead belcher, put a wash on them, give them a couple of highlights, and then your warriors are pretty much done already at that point. With primers, especially the rattle can primers, these, as you can see here on the bottle, are fairly harmful, so I would recommend spraying this outside in a well ventilated area. However, things like an airbrush primer, these typically aren't as harmful as your rattle can ones. You can use these inside, but I would probably just open a window and maybe prime near the window as well. So a base paint such as these here are what we're going to apply over our primer. So our base paints are always going to be our first real main color that we actually put on our model, and base paints are more opaque, and this simply means that they're going to cover over that primer easier and they won't show the primer through as much as other paints. But I would always advise, 2 thin coats, because base paints are fairly thick, so you are going to want to actually thin them down. In comparison to base paints, layer paints are more semi-transparent, so this simply means that our paint underneath will show through our layer paint. Now we can negate this by doing multiple thin coats to really build up the color. However, it is ideal for doing things like transitions. So say we're doing green, we can base coat it in our dark green here, and then we can use our Warpstone Glow to build a transition from our dark green to kind of a mix between the dark green and the Warpstone, and then into pure Warpstone in their highest point. Also, the base paint and layer paint kind of idea is predominantly a Citadel thing. However, some companies, here we've got the Army Painter, they do a triadic color scheme, as you can see here. And this simply is pretty much exactly the same thing. So our Omega Blue on the left would be our base coat, and then these two are layer paints. Shade paints, also commonly referred to as washes, are a special kind of paint where they are already heavily thinned down, and they are ideal for running into all of the deepest recesses of a model, giving your model a lot of depth and contrast. As you can see here, shade paints come in a lot of different colors as well. So these are also very, very good at tinting surfaces. So say you've got a metallic sword and you want to make it just have a tint of purple, you could use something like Druchii Violet, paint that over your metallic, and you would tint the surface into a more purple metallic. Speed paints and contrast paints in reality are very, very similar. Now the main function of these kind of colors are they're kind of like a mix between a base coat and a wash paint all in one. So you would apply these primarily over a light tone, so either a white or like a bone color. And what will happen is you apply this over your surface and it will sit in all of the recesses like a wash, giving you a lot of depth and contrast, whilst simultaneously actually painting the surface of your model into that color. Much like a wash, speed paints and contrast paints are actually also very good for simply tinting the surface as well, and you can thin them down using their respective mediums. So here is speed paint medium, there is also a contrast medium. And for example, I like to thin down my Ultramarines blue contrast paint into more of a purely wash based consistency, and I paint this over things like purples to give the purple a lot of depth and tonal variety. Technical paints are basically special effects paints. So this one here, Nalic Oxide, you would apply this over things like brass to give it a very oxidized look, whereas Blood for the Blood God, this will give you very, very nice blood effects. Things like the Soulstone Blue, these are gemstone paints. So these will dry with a gloss kind of finish, giving you a look of a gemstone. And then equally, we have things like these, which are basing paints. So Sterling Mud, as the name applies, will give you a muddy kind of effect. And Mordant Earth is one of GW's crackle paints. So you'd apply this onto your base, and as it dries, the actual paint pulls apart, giving you a cracked surface. Inks are naturally a very thin paint. However, they are the most pigment-rich paint that you can possibly get. They are very, very intense, and they're really ideal to either change the actual hue of a paint. Again, say if you wanted to do a colored metallic sword, you would have your base coat of, say, Leadbelcher, and you could mix in 2 drops or even 1 drop of an ink, and you would completely shift that entire paint into a blue metallic. They are also very, very good at airbrushing. So if you've got a Zenithal primed model and you wanted to paint, say, a Blood Angel, you could put in some red ink into your airbrush and you could apply this over your model. And due to the fact that they are already very thin, it will apply really, really smoothly, and you'll see the Zenithal highlight through the red ink. Lastly, we have metallics. Now, metallics are another special kind of paint where the actual pigment has physical metallic flakes actually within the paint. And metallics are really, really good, as the name suggests, for painting anything that you want to be metal. So if you want a metal sword and you want it to be silver, you can paint it with Leadbelcher. If you need gold trim, then you can use things like Red Futurama. And wherever the light really catches metallic paints are going to be reflective due to the metallic pigment within the actual paint. The Citadel metallics, as you can see here, these still follow the same base and layer style. So these paints here are all base paints, so these are all opaque. So these will cover over your primer in roughly 2 coats. So this was very much a beginner's guide to understanding paints. There is loads more you can do with paints, but this video is aimed at just understanding what a paint is and what all the differences are, because there's so many of them in today's market. But hopefully this helped, and if it does, then please hit that like button and subscribe, and I will see you on the next one.